these I think are all interrelated issues like free speech, what we talked about Rwanda and so on, which is sort of to what extent are people malleable? To what extent can you influence the mind of someone with persuasion?
Hello and welcome to the newest episode of the Drayton Discourse, brought to you by the Economist Society at University College London.
We are delighted to be hosting Professor David Yanagizawa-Drott today, who is the Professor of Development and Emerging Markets at the University of Zurich and an affiliated professor at the UBS Center for Economics and Society.
Professor Yanagizawa-Drott's research interests include political economy and economic development, and much of his work focuses on the themes of information, culture, and conflicts.
Some of his influential papers discuss issues such as social norms and media influence, as well as the significance of political protests. He has also contributed to handbooks such as the economic aspects of genocides, other mass atrocities and their preventions, and the Oxford Handbook of Propaganda Studies.
Let's proceed with the interview.
Okay, so welcome, Professor. Thank you so much for joining us today. It is an absolute pleasure and honor to have you here with us. So we would like to start off this episode by asking about a couple of questions about your career. So first off, your work predominantly focuses on development economics and political economy. What influenced you to pursue these two supposedly distinct fields? And where have you seen the most innovative work in joining these two fields together?
Oh, wow. Good questions. Yeah, I think it goes back to my undergraduate studies in economics. I sort of did both econ and political science in parallel. And although I was initially drawn to political science because it's a fascinating, I think, discipline and asks a lot of big questions about the role of democracy and like how we should think about human rights and et cetera, and how political power is distributed in society and so on and so forth. Once I've sort of turned to economics, I think initially the first couple of courses were kind of a little bit dull, sort of standard micro, macro, sort of quite abstract and, technical and so on, which is, fine, but isn't, I think, very stimulating. It wasn't for me, at least. But it was once I got a little bit later into my studies, sort of started working on bachelor thesis and then later on master's thesis, that I really sort of fell in love with economics. And at the time, I think I was heavily influenced by sort of work by Daron Acemoglu and like Simon Johnson and Jim Robinson, sort of looking into the long run importance of institutions. And so, yeah, I think that was a big influence. Where you sort of combine, you start thinking about long run economic development, like why are some countries poor and some countries rich? And you start to get like, a different perspective once you start to think about this very long run sort of institutional determinants, and how you can then take that to the data, with like a particular paper that looks into like the colonial origins of comparative development, with looking into like settler mortality in some locations many hundred years ago, how that seemed to have driven first what kind of institutions that were set up, and then ultimately how these countries evolved from an economic perspective. So sort of that was one of the more influential works at the time that sort of combines political economy and development. Since then, I think there's been a lot of really cool work separately in development and political economy, but also combining sort of the two. It seems at the core of many of the laundry list of reasons why some countries have not been able to grow and get lifted out of poverty, how the political system sort of hampers that process seems to be near the top of the range of explanations. And I think the evidence in favor of that sort of hypothesis has really grown over the last 10 to 15 years.
Now on to some questions about your research. So firstly, we have some questions on your paper, Misperceived Social Norms, Women Working Outside of the Home in Saudi Arabia. So in your research, you have used the concept of pluralistic ignorance whilst discussing labour market participation. Could you briefly explain this concept to our listeners in the context of this paper?
Sure. It's I think it's a fascinating concept. It comes from, I think it originates from social psychology. A lot of interesting work in economics these days are, by the way, taking sort of ideas or concepts from other disciplines and sort of thinking, using them, applying them in an economic context. And the notion of pluralistic ignorance has been examined sort of before, I think primarily empirically in a college campus context in the US. Basically, the notion is that some people, we all walk around with our private views and values and opinions, right? Like it can be on political matter, but it can also be on non-political matters, such as, you know, do I want to drink alcohol, for example? Do I want to go to a party and get drunk? Or, you know, like, do I want to smoke cigarettes? And I get some personal enjoyment from that, right? Like in a completely, take out everything social about it and just like whether you enjoy it yourself, right? So we have these sort of private intrinsic preferences or views, right? But once you start putting people in social situations, right? Especially when there are social norms at play, or you maybe want to be socially accepted in a group, or be, you know, liked in a group, or you know, not be socially ostracized and so on, right? Things we probably all care about to some degree. You know, then, you know, people will maybe deviate to some degree from what they want to do just purely themselves, right? Precisely when they think that other people enjoy taking this sort of this action. Now, we could live in a world where there's no sort of information asymmetry. Everything is sort of well known. So I understand my peer groups, what they like, they understand me. It's all good. And we sort of behave sort of accordingly. But then there's this notion of pluralistic ignorance, which is like, for many social situations, we don't actually talk or reveal truly how we feel about some issue. But we do take some actions, right? So I think drinking college campuses was one of the first sort of applications of this, where researchers were able to show that a lot of, this is in the US, that a lot of college students actually don't want to drink or get drunk, but they think that their peers really like that. And because they think that, then they engage in drinking and getting drunk themselves. And so that's the situation of pluralistic ignorance, where sort of you think you're in the small minority on some issue, but in fact you're not. You're in the majority. But it's just that nobody's really, this isn't being revealed somehow, and you just look around and observe behavior. Everybody seems to be drinking and having a good time, so they must be enjoying. They must be really want to do this. So I'm going to do it myself, and then so I just play along, and we're sort of stuck in this false view of reality.
So social norms have been widely used to explain many trends in development economics literature. Do you think pluralistic ignorance could be applied to other behavioural trends being observed in developing countries?
I suspect yes. This is now, I think, a very active space in terms of research trying to answer that question in particular. It is true that there's been a lot of work trying to understand the role of social norms in shaping behavior in, say, developing countries, whether it's economic behavior or sort of not necessarily just like economic behavior, such as, say, female genital cutting or something like this. But this literature, I think it would be fair to say, hasn't really taken this notion of pluralistic ignorance seriously before. It's sort of pretty much implicitly has been assumed that people sort of understand the values and norms of society correctly. And this is the constraint on behavior. And But with this paper that we wrote on Saudi Arabia, I think, and this concept of pluralistic ignorance opens up the possibility there could be many situations where sort of a group of people, a society, whether it's a village or a region or a country as a whole, takes a certain action and sort of assumes that everybody's on board and like to take this action, where in fact most people may actually hate it or not really want to take this action, right? And so I think in the next 5 years or so, I expect there to be a lot more evidence that allows us to understand if this is a widespread phenomenon or not.
So you demonstrated in the paper that clarifying the misperceived social norms regarding women working outside of the home had a significantly positive impact on female labour market participation, illustrating the power of a seemingly small intervention, namely information. Mm-hmm. To what extent do you think concerns about misinformation play a role in ensuring that misperceptions are resolved? And did you see any evidence of this whilst conducting research for the paper?
Depends a little bit what you mean with misinformation. On some level, it's almost like true by definition that people aren't well informed. But I think if you're getting at it's like, say, information spread on mass media platforms, whether it's television, radio, or say social media platforms, it certainly could play a role, and I suspect that, especially with social media, that it does. But you know, the evidence here is like really scarce. Like it's just like it's not like there is a lot of people have studied this and they have established no, it doesn't play a big role, or yes, it plays a big role. It's just because this is a very active research field, we don't have the answers yet, I would say. I think if you just take a step back, you could actually imagine that social media would have the opposite effect, which is the reason why people can walk around in pluralistic ignorance is precisely because of a lack of communication tools. And at least that was the promise, I think, of the optimistic view of social media, which is that, look, social media is amazing in the sense that now everybody has a voice in some sense, and at almost zero cost, you can sort of convey whatever message you want to convey to a large group of people. This was usually exclusive to people sort of in the establishment arena. It cost a lot of money to get a message out, but these days pretty much anybody can say almost anything, right? So in principle, it could actually go the other way around. And maybe both can be true at the same time, right? So in some situations, social media will reveal the truth, and in other situations, it might distort the truth. So I think it's very much an open question. But let me put it this way: I suspect that sort of what we saw in Saudi Arabia, for example, wasn't manufactured because of explicit misinformation on, say, radio or television, you know, or intentional misleading information. I suspect that it has much more to do with the fact that people just don't share their private opinions on this matter very often. And this is probably true for a lot of social circumstances, that we don't truly share our deepest feelings and thoughts on some issue, maybe.
Moving on to your work as a political economist, we have some questions regarding your research on the media and protests. So the Carnegie Endowment of International Peace reports that over 25 of the most significant protests since 2017 have been related to the pandemic. Your work on the US Tea Party movement demonstrated the influential nature of protesting on political change. So applying this result to the pandemic, to what extent do you think protests have impacted policy decisions? Bearing in mind other factors such as economic implications of the pandemic or differing severities of variants, how important would you consider the role of civil unrest in the decision to loosen COVID-19 restrictions?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think if I'm going to try to tied to my own work and the lessons drawn from my own work here. Yeah, I have a paper on the Tea Party movement in the U.S. I have also a more recent paper on protests from Germany in the 1930s when Nazis were marching down the streets of Hamburg. But if we stick with the Tea Party paper, I think the question there, which is a broader one, but falls, the sort of the question you're asking me falls under this broad question, is whether these political protests matter in some sense, right? Because you might think that all really what happens when some people or some political view or opinion marches down a street with some signs that says, whatever it says, it could be, we need to lower the taxes, we need to raise the taxes, or we need to stop climate change, or we need to be anti-abortion or pro-choice, or we need to lift COVID restrictions, or whatever it may be. You could imagine that all that it is precisely what I just described. It's just a section of society that feels particularly strongly about some issue that goes out and shows publicly how they feel about it, right? And so in many ways, this ties to kind of the pluralistic ignorance notion that we talked about before. If you think about it for a second, it's like revealing, like, oh, here's how I feel about this issue, right? Like, and I'm making this very public to everyone, right? But that doesn't mean that anybody else's opinion changes necessarily, right? It could just be, oh, you're pro-choice. Well, I hear what you're saying, but I'm not going to change my stance. I've thought about this myself and I'm not pro-choice. Or like, you're anti-abortion. Look, I've thought a lot about this myself and my view is pretty fixed. Like, I'm not going to be anti-abortion, right? So it could be that it just reflects that certain segments of society feel particularly strongly about some issue, but it doesn't persuade anybody else of that opinion, right? So it doesn't spread. So that's one thing that's, I think, just a generic question that we're basically asking. Another one is when it comes to policies, like, well, if policymakers that are in power observe this happening, right? And suppose, first of all, it doesn't change anybody's views. Again, it didn't persuade anyone of the rest of the population of voters. Well, if sort of politicians are pretty aware of this, it's like, well, there's this minority group, say, in society. It's usually a minority group that protests, by the way, which is sort of interesting, right? It's never kind of, you almost never, well, you basically never see, even with the largest protests, you don't see a vast majority of the population taken to the streets, right? Like that. Some of the biggest protests we've seen, it's still like, hundreds of thousands of people in a population of millions of people, right? So may not even respond to this because there's like, yeah, there's these small segments, they're fringe, but the vast majority are still over here, and I'm going to cater to that majority, right? But sort of, there are two alternative views here, which is, well, first of all, maybe they are actually persuasive. So other people are now convinced that this is the right kind of way forward. And if that effect is big, you can think of, like, for every protester, how many people do they persuade? Is it one other person, two other people, 10 people, and so on? If that effect is big, well, then protest could really matter, right? And it could translate all the way to actually policymakers now reacting to what's going on. And that's basically what we showed in the Tea Party paper. We sort of exploited sort of a natural experiment that on this day there was a day in 2009, April 15th, where there were protests everywhere in the country, or in many, many places, hundreds of towns. And we exploit whether it happened to rain or be sunny on that particular day, because we can show that affected whether people protested and how many people that protested, right? And then we trace in these towns that sort of randomly had good weather versus bad weather, what if people's opinions changed, and if policymakers responsible for those political constituencies, if they changed their views on policy issues. And we show that this happened, right? So that I think is probably the first paper that has established that protests matter for changing the public opinion and ultimately policy. And so now the question becomes one of external validity. There's this, I don't know if you're familiar with these concepts in economics, but there's internal validity, which is sort of within the paper, what do we find? And then external validity is how do we apply those findings to some other context? And so I think this paper is sort of a proof of concept that this can happen. Now, whether it has happened in the case of the pandemic, I can only speculate. But it seems reasonable to me that similar forces are at play. That is, even if there's a minority out there protesting, the fact that they're out there protesting could actually convince people, at least people that are sort of in between. They were maybe not sure, they were sort of marginal. Do I want to continue these restrictions, or do I sort of want to, do we want to stop them? And or maybe I hadn't thought about it too much, but now I see these people on the streets and now I'm convinced. And if that multiplier effect is pretty big, which it could be, we show that it can be, then yeah, that might contribute to some of these trends that we see. Yeah, so I think it's entirely possible, but I'm really speculating here, and I anticipate that actually people will take to the data. I haven't seen a paper on this yet, but I suspect that there will be at least one or a couple of papers that will try to actually estimate this to see if there's an impact.
Okay, great. So also on the topic of media and protests, misinformation has also been an important issue throughout the pandemic, as shown in your recent working paper. So what responsibility does the government have in ensuring accurate information is accessible during crisis? And how can the politicization of the virus be avoided?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question. I think it's become very much a question of focus since the pandemic started. And had you asked me before the pandemic, I don't think I would have predicted the degree of political polarization that this virus has evidently sort of produced. And one question is, to what extent is that about misinformation and just other factors, right? Now, what's the role of the government? Let me put it this way. When it comes to something like a virus, I think here the core foundations should be the scientific method, right? This seems to me to be the best possible approach for figuring out the truth, quote unquote, right? So that involves things like, all right, how contagious is this virus, right? And there are concepts in epidemiology called like the R0, or things of that nature. And then of course, like, what are the risks, health risks, like what's the mortality risk, and so on and so forth. So that's a couple of basic, I think, objects that scientists are best equipped to figure out, right? And then, on top of that, there is this question of, well, how do you reduce the spread of the virus, and how do you minimize health risks, right? So now we get into issues like, should you be wearing masks? How important is social distancing? How effective are vaccines, etc., right? And again, it seems like the scientific method is the best way to go here. Open academic debates about all of these things, peer review process, etc. Try to keep it as transparent as possible. And then the government has an important role here in funding research, right? Funding the academic to produce this sort of knowledge, right? And then when it comes to the conveying of this information, we do have, most government and democracies have units that convey the message, the sort of the latest scientific findings, right? And so that seems like a good principle to stick to. Now you can debate to what extent people in these positions have done that in a appropriate way, right? So, for example, I think early on there was information provided by government on like, well, masks, probably you shouldn't wear them, or they're ineffective, or something like that. And probably the reason they wanted to do that, I'm speculating now, but I think it's pretty well documented, was they were concerned about mask shortage, right, for hospital personnel, right, and didn't want, have a shortage there because people were using it elsewhere, right? So that's not a scientific, that's not based on sort of science. That's more of a policy decision, right? So once you start to bring in like policy, you cloud the scientific sort of conveying information with sort of policy decisions, things can get murky, and people can start to distrust the actual information that's being conveyed by these authorities, right? So it might sound easier than it really is about sticking to the scientific method, right? Because at some point you get into other value judgment about allocating resources in society, and weighing risks versus cost and benefits in society, and that one, science has only limited ability to convey what is the right way forward, right? Like science can say, well, old people are this much more likely to die, say, versus young people. So that stuff scientists can provide. But how much do we value, say, a life of an 80-year-old versus a 20-year-old, right? That the scientists cannot provide a conclusive answer on, right? So that's more of a value judgment that we have policymakers in office for, right? Yeah, so I think that's sort of some basic principles that are important to keep in mind when it comes to a crisis like a health crisis, like the COVID crisis, right? Now you can also debate how applicable this is to other situations of crises, financial crisis, for example, or a climate crisis. But I think there are a lot of common features here when it comes to, for example, how to deal with the climate crisis, right? Again, the scientific method seems this is the one we should support at its core. Let's try to figure out, how how severe the climate change is, and what we can expect in the future, and also what are the most effective ways of dealing with it.
Yeah. So following up on the topics being discussed, you have also conducted research demonstrating the key role of the media in propagating violence during the Rwandan genocide. Considering both the violence in Rwanda and during the pandemic, what do you consider is the equitable balance to be between free speech and preventing the media's potential negative social externalities?
Yeah, this is also a fantastic question. I think there isn't a clear-cut answer here, but let me lay out, I think, some principles and how to think about it. So, first of all, it seems like free speech as a basic human right, which is at the core of the liberal democracy, seems to be a very valuable, right and liberty to sort of. You don't want to. There should be a lot. There should be a lot of negative. How should I put this? If you want to restrict that, you think you probably want to be quite I don't know if conservative is the right way, but you should really be careful in considering how you limit free speech, because it's very, very tricky to do it, right? So then, what are some reasons you would do it, right? You would then ask, right? So I think the Rwanda case is one where, I wrote this paper during my PhD studies. This was part of my thesis. The question there, so what happened in Rwanda right before the genocide and during the genocide is there was a radio station set up by some of the political elites in Rwanda, and there had been a civil war in the country, but there was a peace agreement in place, but there were clearly ethnic tensions in the air. Now, this radio station that was set up was spreading really hateful sort of messages, a lot of false information, a lot of dehumanizing content, attacking the minority group, which was the Tutsi minority group, the group that later was killed. 75% of the population was killed and slaughtered during the genocide, right? And this radio station, even before the killing started, basically incited violence in various forms, encouraging people, first painting a threat of this minority group as they are coming to attack us, we better attack them before they attack us, and spreading a lot of lies on this issue as well, like really making people really fearful of this minority group. So the question in that paper is, well, if there's a media outlet now that's encouraging violence, is it like, does it matter, or is it just like, all right, there's this extreme radio stations saying these messages, but humans are more immune towards this kind of messages than, or, this is, if I hear this message, am I actually going to bring out my machete and go to my neighbor and start killing my neighbor, right? Like that's a very long step, right? From hearing something on the radio to sort of taking that action. I think at the time when I wrote that paper, there wasn't any hard empirical evidence that humans could actually behave in such a way, right? And I think it's reasonable at the time to also think that, look, media can be powerful, but it can't be that powerful, right? It can't like make killers out of people, like. But basically, to cut a long story short, I collected data on where these antennas were and what villages that could sort of happen to be able to listen to this radio station, and others that happen not to because of some of these topographical features, that some villages were sort of behind a mountain and they couldn't get access to the radio signal and so on and so forth. I was able to show that it was this hate speech was quite effective in actually inciting behavior and inciting violence, right? So then this evidence shows that, look, there could be these negative externalities, right? And so there's a real cost of allowing for this kind of, this is an example of where there has a real human cost of allowing this kind of speech, right? Now, the next question then becomes sort of what could have been done. This is a historical episode, but what could have been done to prevent this, and what should have been done to prevent this, which is your question in many ways applied to this situation, right? And that is a much harder question to answer, and I don't think I can answer it with purely scientific sort of approach. Let me just give you a flavor of the kinds of policy questions you get into in such a situation, right? So how would you limit this free speech, first of all, in such a situation? Well, this was something that was discussed in the UN Security Council. It was discussed within various governments in the West, including the State Department in the US, right? And so they figured one way to go is invade the country, right? Now, that is a very big step, which creates international war. That's international warfare, right? That is not something anyone would take lightly. And at the time, there was no appetite in the US for a foreign intervention like that, especially because there had been a debacle in Somalia 1 year before, where they had intervened and put boots on the ground, and really turned into not a good thing. Okay, so now if you're not willing to have a foreign military intervention, what could you do that's sort of less than that? Well, they figure out, well, we could, in principle, send rockets and like destroy these transmitters, right? That's still an act of war. So it's sort of not boots on the ground, still an act of war. So that wasn't picked up. Now, there was a sort of mild version of this, is because the antennas were, this is a small country, and the antennas were quite close to the border, you could in principle fly an airplane around the border and jam the radio station. So you wouldn't actually send rockets, it wouldn't be very violent, but you would still limit the speech, right? Now they made a cost-benefit analysis, or a cost analysis of how much would it cost to fly this airplane and have this jamming and so on and so forth. And I don't know how many $1,000s it was, right? But you know, it's clearly something that would cost money. But at the time, the argument was made in these policy circles that, look, what's the evidence that this kind of radio would actually incite violence? We might suspect that it can, but we don't know, right? So at the end of the day, the decision was made not to do anything, partly because there wasn't any evidence suggesting that this kind of radio station would actually increase violence, right? So I think what my paper brings to that kinds of discussion is, next time something like that happens, you can't quite as easily make the argument, look, there isn't any evidence that this kind of hate speech can actually induce violence, right? So here's a situation where it did happen, right? So whatever sort of cost benefit you're sort of running through your head, like how much you will limit free speech, here's a potential cost that you have to take in consideration if you're not going to limit it, right? So that's one situation where it's an example where you're sort of operating in an international context where the people who are thinking about limiting free speech are some external actor, you know, not from the same country, like sitting across the Atlantic, right, in DC, trying to make decisions, right? There was never any discussion within the Rwandan government to limit it, because those were the people that were actually spewing. I mean, a lot of people in the government position were actually the ones spewing this hate or supporting it or financing it, right? So it's a very, very tricky situation, right? Like, you could ask the question, when should a foreign country limit free speech in another country, right? That's basically what we're asking in the case of Rwanda, right? That, I think, is a distinctly different question, even though it's the same question, but it seems like quite a different context from if you're asking, say, hey, in the UK or in the US, what laws or governing bodies should we have to limit free speech under a democratic process, right? We're no longer talking about, you know, should Sweden be allowed to limit free speech in the UK, which is basically what we're talking about with the Rwandan case, right? It's a very tricky situation, because you get into issues of, well, how do you identify if the speech is above some criteria that you have set of this is not acceptable to say, right? And who are the individuals that are going to sit there and make these judgment calls, right? And what is the criteria that they will use, right? It's very, very difficult, and there are not a lot of examples from around the world where this has been done in sort of an unambiguously unproblematic fashion, right? So that's a long way of saying, like, I honestly don't have the answer there. I think we live in a time now where it's very much on top of people's minds of thinking, like, what is a reasonable level of censorship? Yeah, it's a tough one, and but I do think that more research should be done to understand under what circumstances hateful speech or speech that seems problematic can lead to really bad societal outcomes, these negative externalities that we talked about, because we still don't know a lot about this, right? So at the very least, we need to know a lot more of how potent, how much of a problem it is. And then you need to have research in terms of how can you effectively limit free speech that doesn't go overboard, right? That hits the right level. So I hope that more people will work on this in the future, and so that at least we can understand the phenomenon better before we actually take some policy decisions or designs.
So we have one final question on political economy. So at the 2013 Global Empowerment Meeting at Harvard Center for International Development, you presented your research on the impact of national celebrations, in particular the 4th of July, and found that children who participated in these celebrations are more likely to vote during adulthood. So how do you think this idea would translate to more authoritarian regimes, especially given likely restrictions on voting or corruption within elections? And would we perhaps see adults' views becoming more inclined with the regime, particularly as they are likely to be nationalist states?
Yeah, so it's a good question. Of course, almost by definition, if it's authoritarian regime, people are not allowed to vote free and fairly, right? So there won't be much impact on voting behavior, right? But these, I think, are all interrelated issues, like free speech, what we talked about, Rwanda, and so on, which is sort of, to what extent are people malleable? To what extent can you influence the mind of someone with persuasion, whether it comes in a form of something that looks just like a National Day celebration, right? Or something that is maybe more explicit, sort of like advertisement on TV, or propaganda, or what have you. We do know that children are more malleable in general, right? And so there's this, it's called the formative years hypothesis, which is sort of this literature, essentially in psychology, that tries to understand, like, during what years do you develop primarily your political views and opinions, right? And how sticky are they over time, right? And it seems like the evidence is speaking to, early teenage years, something in that space, middle school, something along that space, up till maybe early 20s or something like this, is the really critical years. And if you take then authoritarian regimes, they make a lot of efforts in promoting an ideology or a view that supports the elites, right? And the maintaining of power structures that exist in society, right? So I think here also there isn't a ton of evidence so far. It's sort of an active research space as well, I would say. There's a relatively recent paper from China, looks at ideology and curriculum, by Noah Yachtman and co-authors. Shows that it can be actually quite influential. Sort of, this is more within schools, right? And so that's a proof of concept that I think in these authoritarian regimes, it's possible to shape these children basically to be more, to have views and sort of political views and opinions that are sort of the elites in power would like the population to have. At the same time, there are probably limits to this. we have seen that totalitarian authoritarian regimes have fallen many times, right? So if the state doesn't deliver to its citizens basic services, education, healthcare, a good economy, you may not be able to overcome all of that with like propaganda.
We'd like to finish up with some less academic questions. So first off, we have a thought experiment for you. So if you could meet any economist from any era, who would it be and why?
Oh, wow. I haven't thought about that question, to be honest, too much. It's sort of funny because I think we live in the best of times in terms of economics, because we're going through this empirical revolution where we're no longer just theorizing and speculating with models of the world, but we're now taking a lot of these ideas to the data, right? And this is where I do most of my own work. It's empirical, trying to understand the world from actually what the data, what the evidence tells me, rather than sort of coming up with a theory of the world that's coherent and interesting, right? So in that sense, I don't have a deep urge to sort of go back and talk to Adam Smith about his views of sort of economics, right? Like, he wrote down his views, right? And so if anything, I'd be more fascinated going back in time and talking to regular people and how they experience the world and how they think about the world, and sort of conveying, like, here's what the situation would look like in 2021. What do you think of that? Or something like this. That I think would be more fascinating, to sort of get the views of regular people, something like that.
And just our final question, what advice would you give to students or young economists who would like to pursue economic research? And which areas in economics would you consider to be the most under-researched?
Yeah, so I think the most important thing that drives everything else is that you work on something that you're passionate about. Because if you don't do, if I tell, hey, this is a really under-researched area, right? Like, I'm sort of speculating myself, and I'm sort of projecting what I think are interesting research questions, right? And even if I'm right that it's under-researched, maybe that's not where your passion is, right? And so you go in there because you want to be smart and sort of like, I'm going to be sort of like hitting the next wave, and you're trying to always like ride some wave before it sort of becomes popular. You might sort of be successful by some metric in the short run, but at the end of the day, like, why are you doing all of this? Is it just to be successful? So I think the best work is often coming from someone who's like really passionate about, like, really want to understand this thing, or has some ideas of your own, and really wants to know the answer to that question. And because if you really have this intrinsic motivation, you want to know the answer to this question, you will put in the hours, you will try to acquire the tools and the whatever data you need to collect, and a lot of good things follow from that, right? And if there's a large set of young economists out there that we all follow that basic principle, I think as a group we will reach really good answers in the end, right? So I think that's at the core. it's so easy to get sidetracked from that, though. Other people say, I don't believe in what you're doing, or, you know, I don't find that particularly interesting. And so there'll be a lot of naysayers. That's always true. And so if you're sort of trying to ride what other people think you should be working on, you can very easily get sidetracked, and at the end of the day, maybe not even enjoy what you're doing. So this basic principle of following your passion, I think, is an important one. It's not always easy to stick to.